Hello and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. My name is Dan Taylor.
My name is John Micton. Join us twice a month at the International Schools Podcast as we have conversations with international school leaders, educators, and entrepreneurs working and engaging in the world of international schools and education.
And finally, just to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, ASA for Education, for making this podcast happen. Now on to the episode. Hi, welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm delighted to have a returning guest, Denry Machin. I think that's how you say your name. I got it wrong the first time. Is that right? Machin? Machin?
I'm slightly wrong again, Dan. Machin. As I said the last time, I've been called far worse.
I should have listened to the last episode. And Denry was on as a returning guest. He's written a very good book called The Teacher's Guide to International Schools, which I can see on the shelf behind him. And a great book. Everyone should read it.
Everybody who's doing podcasts and's got books has to have their book on the bookshelf.
Yeah.
I felt left out not having it last time.
I don't have it. Yeah, I've got my map of the world, which is my wife. It's wallpaper, actually, which I quite like. It's cool. So we talked last time about Denry's book, and I want to have a chat about the business of international schools, which I'm really interested in. And Denry's, studied quite extensively, and he's also working in Asia, which is one of the big growth areas. So yeah, sounds good, Denry. If you're open to it, let's talk about the business of international schools.
A big topic, Dan. Where would you like to start?
I think we should start with. I'll tell you how I got interested in this. I read this book called "The Rise of Transnational Education Corporations" by someone called High-End Kim, and I actually tried to track. I don't even know if it's a man or a woman. I tried to track them down online. Very anonymous person, and written a really good book. So I'm surprised they're not doing more. I don't know if you know them at all.
I don't. I know the book and I know the name, but I don't know the.
Really good book. And even though it's like an academic book, it reads quite well. And it talks a lot about how these education companies started. So that's what got me interested in it. I presume you've read the book, Denry, as you said. So let's start with how did it begin? I mean, obviously we talked on the last podcast. I'll put a link to the last podcast. We talked about how initially international schools were just, for the children of expats, diplomats, et cetera, and then sometime I think around 20 years ago, they started being a boom with the increase in local families that wanted to send their kids in for-profit. I mean, what did you see as the start of this sort of trend of for-profit schools?
So the turn was in about 1996 when Dulwich opened in Phuket in Thailand. I'm based in Thailand. Dulwich has since lost the license to that school and changed, but so back in 1996, Dulwich was
Phuket, wasn't it? Yeah, I went there. It became the British school Phuket. I went when it was Dulwich, actually.
Yeah. So in 2003, something like that, it changed brand, but it was the first of the British branded schools to open in Asia. As I say, back in 96, and that kind of signals a turn in the industry from what previously had been slow and steady growth of what we traditionally call Type A and Type B schools, and we can perhaps get into those definitions if you'd like. Type A and Type B schools had dominated the market, and Dulwich School, Phuket, was the first of the British branded schools. Since then, and particularly since 2014, there's been an acceleration in growth of franchise schools, of for-profit schools, to the extent now that the 80% of schools in the market are for-profit.
Interesting. Do you know how Dulwich started? Because that's interesting to me. I didn't know that the British franchise schools, however you call it, would have started it. I thought it was maybe some independent ones. But what happened? Because obviously you can talk a bit about, a lot about how this happens. I know it's usually a local company, be it a property company or all private equity, they all get the kind of the rights. I mean, do you know how this came about? Did you think Dulwich approached some people and said, I want to run a school? Or do you think an Asian business person approached them? And do you know about how it began?
So it is very different today than was the case back then.
Yeah.
In those days, and Harrow Bangkok followed fairly swiftly afterwards with Dulwich. It was entrepreneurial, enterprising bursars in the UK schools who had connections in Asia either through the governing bodies of those schools in the UK, either through their own business interests, potentially even old boys and old girls from those schools themselves. So they had their global networks. And these were literally conversations in clubs, in airport lounges about, at the time, the growth in Asia and the opportunity to franchise, to license their brands overseas. And that was certainly the case for the initial conversations for Harrow. It was an entrepreneurial and enterprising bursar who offered the brand to a local partner.
Interesting. And who was starting these schools? What kind of people were in Asia were running these, like the Dulwich and the initial ones?
So, and again, very different now to historically. Then it would have been private investors, so sole proprietorships, rich, wealthy business people who'd already made their money elsewhere. And in those days, potentially for reasons of legacy rather than for reasons of profit, wanted to get into the educational space. So many of the traditional, non-traditional schools, the original branded schools, forays into Asia, originally started out or were funded by their local owners for legacy reasons rather than explicitly for profit, although that has shifted more recently.
Got it. And so Dulwich did this. They've got a few schools. Did they expand quickly? And you mentioned Harrow. Like, what was like the second phase? Was there a bunch of, I mean, because I've seen now, like in recent years, many more British schools. Obviously Dulwich and Harrow are pretty famous. Most people in England would know Harrow for sure. Maybe most people would know Dulwich, but now there's a bunch of schools which I've never heard of, and I work in education. But so we'll get onto that, I guess. But what was the next stage? Like, what did they open a bunch of schools? Did people follow? Like, what can happen next, as far as you know?
So Dulwich and Harrow were at the frontier. They were the first of the two groups. So Dulwich now have 8. And Harrow have 9 campuses. It's more schools, but there are 9 campuses. Dulwich originally grew faster than Harrow, and then Harrow's growth over the last few years has been more rapid. So they started to see, I guess, the level of risk went down as Asia was developing and as the business models had started to prove themselves, and they started to see opportunity in other countries in Asia. So both groups started to expand steadily from 1996 to about 2014, expanded relatively steadily, and were slowly being joined by other schools moving into international markets, not in huge numbers, but as we got closer to 2014, the pace started to pick up.
Did they get? I mean, obviously there was a financial crisis in 2000. Do you think did that affect the start of it, and did that affect Asia as badly as it affected the rest of the world?
It certainly did. Again, it's a different conversation, but in the majority of these schools, a lot of the children are local nationals. And it is one of the reasons why investors want to invest in these schools. Again, this is a different track of the conversation. They are, to some extent, immune from economic shocks, like, for instance, the 2007, 2008 crisis. It is the not-for-profit schools that are populated with expatriate children that tend to be affected by economic shocks to a greater extent than those schools which are attracting locals. So yes, growth slowed down during that period, but clearly it didn't stop growth. There were still schools that opened during that period.
Yeah, interesting. Now, how did it go? I'm guessing I'm just looking at the timeline. Because obviously we'll get onto it, but I mean, a lot of these schools have changed hands multiple times. I was looking at some, we're actually going to live in Dubai for a while, funnily enough, and I was looking at some schools there, which if you look back a few years ago, they had different names, and so they've obviously been acquired and things. But what happened? Obviously, the British schools moved in. Did then a bunch of local people start setting up schools as well? They saw this as a business opportunity and doing that.
So some of those were there already and have grown with the market. Others, yes, saw the opportunity and have established schools with various versions of British or international school names to kind of piggyback off the growth of these franchised branded schools. But there was a dual track of growth in the franchise schools and all of the factors that are increasing demand for international schooling in general, which saw you'd either got your big investors with deep enough pockets to approach a UK school or even an American school, although there are fewer of them in the market, and to build a big 1,800 student or whatever campus. That's one segment of the market. And then there's the smaller, more local style, for want of a better phrase, investor building the tier 2, middle tier schools at a slightly smaller scale.
Interesting. Now, what so do you talking about the business side of things, that's what we're getting into today. Like, do you think, I presume running a school must be profitable or there wouldn't have been such a growth. The economics to me, I can see you've got huge startup costs. That's the thing about starting a school. You've massive costs, real estate, construction. You've got to hire a bunch of teachers. You've got to do sales. Like, you have to have investors or deep pockets, I'd guess, to even think about starting a school. I guess that's why it was, fairly well-established businessman or private equity and stuff who did it.
At the scale that we're talking about, for many of the franchise schools, the British branded schools, yes. Less so for some of the smaller, again, for want of a better phrase, local investors who may have set up a 400-role school. I guess a good example of that track would be Bangkok Prep here. So Bangkok Prep, locally owned, not owned by a corporate group, not franchised. They started off, and I don't know their specific numbers, they started off at a relatively modest size, say 600 students, and then have recently moved to a second, much larger campus 3 years ago, maybe, as they have grown and as the market has grown. Very, very different development track to a franchise school coming in and opening a school that can take 1,800 students from day one.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started working with Thailand, which was 10, 11 years ago, the school we worked with, I'm still in contact with them, was the American School of Bangkok, which is, very official sounding, but it is a for-profit school owned by a Thai family locally. Yeah. And, it was interesting. They started off with one campus and they had another campus. And it's funny, how it all works, because I was chatting to a couple of parents about, the school. And they didn't even realize it was a for-profit school. They just thought it's the American school. It must be something to do with the American embassy. And their kids went there, It's funny how, like, the companies that run this are very careful about how they brand. You don't find anything on the website, maybe a link to a school group at the bottom, but, there's very branded very much about nothing to do with being a corporation or anything.
Yes, absolutely. If one doesn't know, you would have to dig quite deep within the individual schools' websites and then into the corporations' websites to find out that they are for-profit schools. And certainly in the case of sole proprietorships that may be for-profit schools, but are not part of a group, are not franchised, you wouldn't know that they were running for-profit.
Definitely. Now, let's move, I guess, a bit more up to date into the 2010s. Like, you mentioned things are very different today. And obviously we talked, I mentioned there's a huge number of British schools going, huge number of it. Like, what is it looking like today? Because I was looking at, there's even more schools still opening. I was talking to a guy in Hong Kong that's setting up charter house schools in Asia. And there's a whole bunch of different schools now. What's the situation looking like now for all these schools? And I'm curious what you think if the slowdown because of COVID is going to affect it or what. But I guess that's a separate question. First question is what does it look like now in terms of the growth of these?
Well, you're right. We have to separate kind of the pre-COVID era, and then there's COVID, and then there's the question mark over whether the post-COVID era will look the same as the pre-COVID era. Maybe this is just a bump in the road, and in 10 years we'll all have forgotten about it. We can hope, or maybe it will significantly shift the path of international school growth. So today, ISC research, 12,500 schools in Thailand alone. There are 260. Bangkok's got 153 schools. I actually looked up for yourself and John. Czech Republic has got 76 international schools, if you can believe it.
That's like, I mean, you know, I've compiled what I think is a pretty good list of international schools, and that number is hugely inflated. That's including maybe a local school that does IB, and maybe even in primary years. It's including kindergartens and things. You know, like I think that the numbers are still high. You know, I mean, Czech Republic, honestly, international schools, even for profit, like a real international school, there's maybe 10, probably, you know, 9, 10 is the actual number of actual international schools. And then there's a whole bunch of schools which, you know, maybe it's a Czech school that has an English section in it and it's a state school, you know, but yeah, it's a huge, we talked on the last podcast how to classify these, but however you look at it, it's a huge growth.
So, you know, the market at the moment is significant in size in terms of number, and again, however one defines them. It is also significant in terms of, you know, the amount of money that it's generating for the individual schools and for the franchise holders. It's perhaps worth looping back to, you almost asked the question in terms of how profitable are these schools? You know, what is the incentive for the owners? And this is in the public domain. Back in 2012, it was being reported that the schools were making approximately 20% profit. We can debate whether we should be calling it profit or surplus, but profit margins were 20%. Today, the ratio that's quoted is 20 to 40%. So you can see that since 2012, there has been an increasing businessing, an increasing corporatization of education that is squeezing out extra profit margin, surplus, whatever words we want to use. That clearly begs the question: where's that money going? So it's going to the license holders. Obviously, if it's a franchise school, then the license holder in the UK or the US is getting some of that. It's going to the management companies. So again, the likes of Dulwich College International, Harrow International Management Services, Brighton College have their equivalent. They are taking some of that to run their management companies. And back to your point about locals, it's also going to the local investors in terms of turnover rent. So for the local investors, they're getting a turnover rent on the property, because in very few cases do these schools own the real estate. They're leasing it from a local property developer, and that property developer, in many cases, wants a school because and this is certainly true in China, because they have a property development of which they want the school to. Schools have a halo effect on property and real estate developments. So if you can bring a Harrow, a Dulwich, a Brighton College, a Marlborough to your real estate development, then you're going to bring commerce, you're going to bring residents to that area. So it's very attractive for investors from that point of view. Added to which it's attractive for private equity, as we've already said. To some extent, international schooling is immune from economic shocks. It is one of the last expenses that parents will cut when they need to tighten their belts, whether that's the 2007-2008 crash or whether that's COVID. It's one of the last expenses they cut. So if you're a private equity firm, if you're a pension fund, international schooling is a good investment. So on the supply side of things, if UK brands want to expand overseas, there is local financing available for them to do so.
Interesting. Yeah, I was reading that healthcare and education are typically the two things that have increased above the rate of inflation for, I don't know, the last 20, 30 years. So yeah. And what about acquisitions? Because like a lot of these, it seems to be more and more, you hear about things like, these companies getting acquired, schools getting acquired. Is that something that's kind of happening a lot, you think? These schools get acquired by different groups, or mostly they stay in the same ownership?
So not with the franchise schools. So this would be with the locally owned schools. The modus operandi for the groups that are doing the buying tends to be that they buy sole proprietor schools and schools that are in the mid-market, in which they see headroom for improvement. And how they judge that headroom, I couldn't comment specifically, but it will be that they see that there's headroom for performance improvement across all aspects of the school, and educationally and financially, and in terms of its appeal to parents, etc., its standing in the market. So they go in and they take over, again, usually on lease terms. So they'll be paying a turnover rent to the original owners of the building, to manage those schools for a 20-year management agreement.
Interesting.
So what you tend to find is that the local owners have run the school 10, 15, 20 years, and they've taken it as far as they can. They become frustrated, perhaps, with trying to run the business, or are a little older, and that they are willing to have somebody else come in and run the school for them. And the likes of Nord Anglia, Cognita, GEMS, would add that there are lots of others as well, would come in and manage those schools for them.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned that things were different now. So in terms of the UK school groups, how are they doing it now? Because obviously we mentioned there's a lot of, I keep seeing new groups of mostly English schools, even Scottish schools I've seen recently doing these groups. How are they doing it now? Obviously, is it kind of an established path when people are approaching these schools? I presume it's not still the bursars anymore that are doing these deals. Yeah.
So the market is much busier in that regard. There are whole forums, investor forums, meet and greets for UK schools to meet potential investors. And there are companies all over the world, but certainly in Asia, acting as agents to make those connections, taking their finder's fees for making a connection between a potential branded school, whether that's in the UK, the US, or Australia, and local investors. So there's a whole industry surrounding this.
And what do any of these English schools actually manage it themselves, or is it just pretty much? And I'm curious, what connected to that, what is the involvement? Because for example, my own children, literally, because we're going to be, living in Middle East for a while. We're thinking of Asia in the future, so it's actually a real life situation for me. I'm looking at international schools. What involvement do the English schools actually have above, the name? Do they do quality assurance? Is there actually a connection between the schools? Does it vary? What do you think? What's their actual involvement in these schools? And because obviously a name's one thing, but I mean, if you're sending your child to whatever, a Shrewsbury, you think, well, that's a pretty well-known school. They've got great sporting facilities. They've got great academics. I'm hoping to get some of that. How do you see what they actually do, the English schools?
So it varies, and very difficult to comment because it varies so much between the individual groups.
Yeah.
The likes of Marlborough College, they say that they are a branch campus and not a franchise. And when they originally set up, they were very clear that they're a branch campus, clearly in an attempt to differentiate themselves from other schools where it is to a greater extent a more hands-off relationship.
Yeah.
I can't speak for all schools, but in general, yes, there will be quality assurance. In most cases, the schools will have at least one, if not two or three, governors from the mothership in the UK or the US on the board of the international schools. In the case of the smaller groups, it may be the same two or three governors that are on the board of all of the different international schools. Yeah. Clearly, the larger the group, the more difficult that gets, but there would be governance as well. I have done CIS accreditations for branded schools where the home school also inspects, and in this case it was termly. So they flew over at the franchise school's expense. They flew over a team of teachers who inspected, accredited the franchise school on a termly basis. Whereas others, it is much more hands-off. They have licensed the name. There will be quality assurance, but not to the same extent. So it really does vary depending on the school group and the UK model itself.
Interesting. You mentioned Marlborough having the kind of branches. Is there any other schools that are doing that approach as well, that it's actually a branch of the school and not so much like a franchise?
There are, but I wouldn't be able to pull the names from my head right at the
Yeah,
moment.
I'm curious.
Yes.
And you mentioned American school. I didn't realize American schools were doing this. I thought it was just British schools.
So there are a few. Canadian, not American, but Branxton Hall is in Jeju. Dwight School, which is American, has got in Seoul and Dubai, as it happens.
Yeah, there's a few actually. Yeah.
So there are American schools. It is interesting, and it is an interesting question to ask: is why have the British schools dominated the market? So British schools that are British in orientation, not necessarily British branded schools, make up over 40% of the international schools market. Again, with the caveat that definition of international schooling is very broad, but it is over 40% of the market are British in orientation. Actually, it is only 1% that are franchised. The Harrows, the Shrewsburys, the Brightons, the Dulwiches, the Marlboroughs only account for 1% of the total international school market, but over 40% are British.
And what are the other 39% then? What are the other ones that are not these schools? You mean it's like just a British school of a British curriculum?
Yeah. So as you already said, British International School Phuket, British School Bangkok, Bangkok Prep, Dubai British School.
Yeah. Now, what about I guess China is the big thing, isn't it? Like, I want to talk about China and the Middle East are kind of two areas I'm interested in, because obviously there's been a lot of growth in sort of Southeast Asia and stuff like, but it seems now it's China is where the most schools are opening up. Is that right?
So as you say, China and the Middle East have been the big growth markets over the last decade. And certainly since in this new era of growth, since 2014, China has, and for obvious reasons, dominated.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, do you think obviously there's some new laws now as restricting sort of, I think Chinese, there's all kinds of things. I know some tutors had to be based in China, and it seems like China's clamping down on foreign education. And the guy I was talking to from Charterhouse was saying there was all kinds of restrictions on, they had to do a Chinese curriculum. Do you think this could sort of stop the growth of these schools in China or slow it down?
I think it will change the way that they grow. Ultimately, demand for education in China isn't going to go away. How that demand is met will change over the next 2, 3, 5 years, decade, as it becomes clearer how these new rules are going to be enforced, how they're going to be interpreted, how they're enforced and interpreted in different regions of China, and what the potential workarounds may be in order to do business in China. And bearing in mind that the schools are already potentially operating under a number of different licenses on one campus. So they may operate under one name, but within that name, there are several different legal licenses to allow them to operate, let's say, to have kindergarten education, compulsory grade 1 to 9 education, and then post-compulsory education. So the situation may have got legally more complex, but the demand it will still be there. How that demand is met may shift and change.
What's your prediction? So we can come back to this podcast in 10 years and see if you're right, or 20 years. What's your prediction? I'll put you on the spot here. No one's going to know for 10 years, but and if it was a good one or not. What do you think is going to happen with the international schools sector? We're recording this 2021, like say 10 years, 20 years, or whatever timeline you want to pick. What's going to happen, you think? If you're going to pick some big sort of global trends.
Just let me get my crystal ball out. And I'll give my crystal ball.
You're as good as anyone to ask this question,
So very, very difficult question to answer. I think we will see continued growth. I think we will see a slowdown in growth. There's a lot of talk about
slowdown in the rate of growth, you mean, but still growth.
In the rate of growth, a lot of talk about saturation. So back when I did my PhD, I calculated at the time, this was just for Bangkok, I did it for a number of markets, but I calculated that there was 20 to 30% headroom in the market in essence, excess demand. So fees could have gone up by 20, 30%, and demand wouldn't have gone down by an equivalent amount. I'm sure if I ran that same analysis today, there wouldn't be anything like the same amount of headroom in the market. But we're still seeing growth. There's still opportunity in the market. So I think the next decade will see continued growth, but the rate of growth will slow down. It's going to be more difficult to grow in China, and the nature of that growth will be different. I think we're going to see an awful lot.
What will be the nature of the growth?
So I think we're going to see more bilingual schools.
Bilingual,
and
yeah.
I think that will be true of a lot of markets. So to date, a lot of the growth in international schools has come from either the upper classes or new middle classes. As the middle classes becomes saturated, the premium, super premium and premium schools, growth obviously is then going to be at the lower end of the middle classes, and therefore there will be growth in schools to meet the needs of the lower middle classes, which is more likely to be bilingual. Children of lower middle class families perhaps less likely to go overseas to university, perhaps less likely to have longer term aspirations to be working overseas, see their futures as being based in South America or Thailand or Vietnam or Cambodia, or within the Middle East, don't see themselves living a global life, but want an international education and an education in English. So that we'll see an increase in bilingual schools meeting lower middle class growth.
Got it. Do you think is the traditional international school, is that done? I mean, obviously most are going to stay going, but do you think is there any chance that someone's going to open up a new International School of Prague non-profit foundation? Like, I mean, I personally think it's unlikely. But do you think that's gone forever? I mean, the schools are going to remain, I presume, but do you think there's any new ones ever going to open?
Hang on, my crystal ball's just reset. Not at scale. Because if you were an investor with that kind of money, and given the figures that I just quoted back to you, why would an investor not open for profit? Unless, and again, you could ask the same question, unless it was an oil company opening in a new location, and as was the case pre-96, oil companies funding the opening of schools to accommodate staff children. So there may be exceptions like that, but then again, why would the oil company not just get Nord Anglia et al. To run their schools for them if that was the case? So you can certainly see a market where in new growing locations, perhaps in Eastern Europe, in Africa, we get small not-for-profit schools opening up, as they traditionally did, to serve a local population, to serve a growing expatriate population, community schools. But at scale, probably not. I guess too much money out there, and a proven business model, too attractive an opportunity for commercial investors.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'll tell you a personal anecdote, because as I mentioned, I've been contacting some schools in Dubai, and every school, even like Repton, I spoke to Repton, they're offering discounts, 10%, 20% discount. They've even, it's kind of like funny, but they've even got on their website some sale, 10% off education. Like universally, I've only spoken to 3 schools, but they all did the same thing, which is interesting. So I've never seen schools like discounting like that, openly saying we're giving a discount on fees before.
Yeah, so that's the COVID effect.
Yeah,
and the Middle East has perhaps been more affected by that than some countries in Asia. But that's the return of expats to the UK, the US, Australia. Those schools having places to fill, and excess supply. Well, now excess supply in Dubai. So a large number of school places. And a lack of ability of the local middle classes to afford those school fees.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Also, I wonder about, because I don't know if John mentioned it in the last podcast, but he was telling me about in Luxembourg where he works, the government is setting up a bunch of international schools, and they're not sure how it's going to affect them. But you know, the proper full-on international schools, English language. You know, obviously they'll have French as well. But and I've noticed that in Czech. I'm not sure how much of a trend it is because I haven't mapped it over many years. But there's a lot of local schools offering English language programs now, and a lot of parents want their kids to go to these schools. Do you think that's a trend that's going to continue as more local countries offer like an English language kind of semi-international school experience?
Yes. It may be better to call that international education rather than international schooling. Yeah. And then that brings us back to how we define international schools, indeed how we define international education. But we will see an increase in international streams in local schools across the range of price points. Even as is the case in Luxembourg, assumedly they're state schools or state funded, possibly public-private partnerships, even in state schools offering international streams as well.
Yeah. So I think one thing I'd like to talk about is like, you know, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Maybe we can have a disagreement here. You know, I've kind of agreed with everything you've said so far, so maybe we can disagree. I mean, my opinion is it's a good thing. I think for-profit schools are a good thing. It's interesting. I read you wrote a very good paper, the International School Gold Rush, I think it was called, which, by the way, includes liberal use of the word neoliberalism, which is a word that only academics use in it. I've never heard that word used in the wild outside of an academic paper.
Either academic papers or in The Guardian.
Yeah, The Guardian, yeah, exactly. I think it's a good thing. And I guess, and I'm curious what your opinion is. Like, I'm going to base it partly on my own education. I went to a few different schools, but I finished up at a state school. And it was pretty crap, to be honest. It was the Thatcher years. There was a lot of strikes. Teachers weren't motivated. You know, a lot of understanded teachers. And I was reading somewhere that in the UK, to pay the cost of government, of the taxpayer, obviously, like something like £20,000 for each student per year. That's roughly what the cost is. And I was thinking, well, there's plenty of good private schools could educate you for that. So you know, for me, given that the state, and I'm no like arch capitalist, you know, I agree in a welfare state and things like that. But when it comes to education, I think the government is not efficient at running education. And if my parents have the choice of being given 20,000 and say, well, you can top it up to another school or you can go to this school, I think it would encourage innovation, people to set up new schools. So I guess from that point of view, I think I do agree with the for-profit thing. And I'm curious what you think.
Definitely putting me on the spot. And I am trained to sit on the fence. Sure. So my PhD was looking at both sides of the debate and very firmly positioning me deliberately. Otherwise, I would have got ripped apart at Viva as sitting on the fence. So all of my research has been neutral. And I've actually on Medium, I've got a paper called The Morality of Profit, which the sign off at the end is that I leave the reader to make their own conclusion, sure. Which classic sitting on the fence. I think to turn the question around, we have to ask good for who. And you know, there are obviously a variety of different stakeholders and shareholders, a variety of different stakeholders within this equation. It is interesting if, and again, you know, how does one define for-profit education? Sure. So James Tooley, a researcher from Buckingham University, he did a study on schools in Africa. And I think this came up a little bit in your conversation with Declan on the podcast. So there are a lot of ostensibly for-profit schools in Africa that are very low fees, you know, some potentially as low as $1 a day, that are providing an education to the African middle classes, a quality of which they simply would not be able to get from the state system. So in those examples, for-profit education is providing something much more efficiently, and it is providing something that the market, the state, is simply not able to provide. So in that case, it can only be a good thing. If we look at the other side, if we take these the branded schools, ultimately it then becomes a question about the morality of profit, and if the children in those schools are being provided a quality education, does it matter whether or not the school is for profit?
And I would say it doesn't matter. What's the argument? What's the argument against my opinion?
Yeah, and usually the argument against is morality.
Right.
Rarely are arguments against for-profit education rational. They are more normally emotional and based on some sense that profiting from education is inherently morally wrong. Would be decisions that are made that affect the education that is being delivered, and that would certainly be true in some cases, though by no means all. There are some world-class for-profit schools out there and world-class not-for-profit schools out there. There are also some very bad for-profit schools and some very bad not-for-profit schools. So really the question can't be about is for-profit or not-for-profit better. It's about what an individual school is doing with that profit and the decisions that an individual school is making about how much surplus is taken out and how much remains. A really interesting point, perhaps if we say that the profit margins of a for-profit school, an efficient one, these days between 20 and 40%. I gave examples of where some of that profit is going. The brand holders, the management companies, the local landlords, but local landlords would be the case if the school was leasing its premises anyway, or had loaned the money from a bank. A question often asked, where does the additional economic rent go? Where does the additional surplus go? A lot of the heads in not-for-profit schools told me when I was doing the research for my PhD that it goes to teachers in their salaries. So that if you work as a teacher in a not-for-profit school, on average, in a like-for-like school, you would be paid more than in a for-profit school.
Sure.
Was a finding of my PhD. Interestingly, that flips around for the heads. The head of a for-profit school will earn relatively more than an equally sized, similar context, not-for-profit school. And when I questioned the heads why that might be the case, their response was, "What price your soul?"
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So
interesting.
They felt that were not quite selling their educational soul, but potentially compromising their educational beliefs on occasion was what required additional salary. Now, again, I am only reporting there what was reported back to me in the PhD. My personal opinion on that is neutral. They were just the findings.
Yeah, interesting. The whole salary thing of leadership is interesting because I was I know next to nothing about the UK sector. I'm not that involved in it. But I was reading something about a lot of these trusts and multi-academy trusts and what the CEOs were getting, and there's plenty of these guys getting £500,000 a year. Which I was shocked. I didn't realize you could make that in the state sector in the UK. Which is more than you'd make at virtually any international school, I would think.
For some of the academy heads in the UK, there will be heads that are earning those salaries.
Yeah.
In international schools, large, very, very large international schools. Yes, they may be within touching distance of that.
Yeah.
Maybe not 500,000, but
no, it's still
generous salaries.
Definitely, still pretty good. That's covered most of the points I want to. Is there anything I haven't talked about that you think would be good on this topic? I mean, there's probably a million things you could say, but anything specific?
There's also, I guess, another point with the morality of profit. The analogy is always there's a sense of discomfort and disquiet about making profit from schools, but nobody questions if a construction company makes profit from building the school. or the caterer makes profit from feeding the children, or the bus company makes profit. Profiteering, maybe, but there's a really interesting conversation there about where is that line? At what point does making a profit, making a surplus, become profiteering, and at what point does operating a school efficiently for the good of the children and at a world-class level, but also making a surplus? Why are the questions about that potentially being immoral and somehow wrong? It is a really interesting area of debate. I don't think we'll ever reconcile that. And it was interesting talking to the heads about how they reconciled that, which in essence was the stuff of my PhD, rather than talking about what happens in the schools in terms of how they do business. It was how business does the heads, what doing business does to the head's professional identity. And like I say, some said what price your soul. Others said, I love the chalk dust under my fingers, but I get a buzz from the business stuff as well. So there was a whole range of different responses to this businessing of education.
Interesting. I mean, there's no question about the demand now. I mean, it seems like a lot of the countries where this growth happened is when it was triggered by some change in the law saying international schools were allowed. I know that in Thailand something like that happened, didn't it? Where they allowed foreign schools to move in, and I think where I've heard of countries allowing for profit, it's just triggered a huge amount of different price range schools to come into the country.
So one of the questions and essays that I give to MBA students is the best thing a country could do to improve its state education system is to ban international schools. Discuss. So I should throw that question. You've thrown some difficult questions at me, Dan. I should throw that back at you. The best thing a country can do to improve its state education system is ban international schools. Discuss.
Yeah, I would say that it's an interesting point. The disadvantage of that approach is you'd have a bunch of people who are currently going to the international school that the state would have to then fund to go to the state school. So the burden of the state would increase if you took that approach. So we would have to spend more money because everyone who goes to an international school has been a local person, has been taken out of the state system, So I would say from that point of view, it's going to cost the country more. I mean, the argument, we haven't even talked about it, but the argument is then it's in terms of equality and stuff. I mean, is it, some people would say it's not right for someone to have more advantage in education, and I've got some sympathy with that. My argument would just be that you can't stop it. It's inevitable that some people will have more advantages. But that is a really interesting point. If banning international schools, has it happened? Has any country done that?
Well, certainly controlling international schools, as we've just discussed in terms of China and Indonesia, the same. So no, not outright banning, but controlling and controlling the growth. Clearly, the question is a provocation, and that there's no right or wrong answer to it. Arguments on both sides. In terms of the tax position, the cost position, the retort to that is generally, if one takes the middle class voice out of state education, then one also takes out the impetus for improvement. So that there is less pressure on the government to improve education, to better spend its taxes on education, because the middle classes have got an alternative option elsewhere and are being allowed to want to opt out, and are being allowed to opt out of the state education system. So there's a drag down effect as that middle class voice is removed from education. One of the flip sides is that importing international education, importing world-class education, enables a country to fast-track improvement of its own state education systems. Although in brackets, and it's a rhetorical question or an open question, don't know the answer. I wonder whether there are good examples of countries where there has been a transference of knowledge between the international sector and the state sector. That would be some really interesting research. Maybe it's out there, but some really interesting research to do, because one of the strong arguments would, as I say, would be they're importing educational quality from which their own state sector can benefit. The general argument is it stops a brain drain. So if you've got international schools in your country, then you are stopping children, families leaving your country to go and get education elsewhere. And then over the long term, obviously contributing to innovation, GDP within your own country.
Yeah, that is interesting.
So, not an easy question to answer, and as I say, a provocation. But when you ask that question to a group of 25, 30 senior managers doing an MBA, it always raises eyebrows and always prompts some very interesting discussion. For many of them, it'll be the first time they've ever thought about it in those terms.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't support banning international schools, but one thing I would support is that I think all politicians should have to send their kids to the state schools, because I think you'd get completely different focus on it because generally speaking, it doesn't affect them in any way. It's like, it's the vague something that goes on in the background. But I think I'd support that. I'd say in Britain, especially, which is a country I know the best, like if you're going to be a politician, you can, but you have to use NHS and you have to send your kids to a state school.
Yeah. I guess that's a similar argument to taking the middle class voice out of education by having.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what made me think of it.
Yeah. My position obviously would be that they shouldn't be banned. Ultimately, they paid my salaries for the last 2 decades.
Sure.
So yeah, I would be without a job.
Yeah, no, for sure. Look, Denry, really interesting chat as always. Hopefully, we can get you back on to talk about some more topics. Thanks very much. We'll put links to where, I don't remember, are you most active on LinkedIn, or I think Twitter you're not so active, are you?
So people can find me on LinkedIn. Various pieces of my writing are on Medium, so people can find the Morality of Education piece on LinkedIn. Just search for my name. They could buy the book, International Schooling, the Teacher's Guide. If anybody wants access to the academic papers, if anybody's struggling to sleep at night and would like to wade through 8,000 words of academic papers on these topics, they can send me a message on LinkedIn. And I'll be happy to share.
Yeah. Thanks, Denry.
Thank you, Dan. Enjoy